Hey, go ahead and grab your Bibles and open up to Romans chapter 7. If you don't have a Bible you feel like you can read and understand, grab the Bibles from the ends of the row, pass them down, or open up your smartphone. Welcome if you're hanging out with us at mochurch.tv. Super glad that you're here hanging out with us today. My name's Curtis Teel, and I'm our Twinsburg, Macedonia campus minister. We're going to get there a little bit. We're continuing on in our God of Grace series today. One of the things my wife and I feel extremely lucky, extremely blessed to have, is my parents moved out here and they live extremely close. And so that means that our three daughters, Hadley, KJ, and Berkeley, get to go over Grandma and Grandpa's house and spend a lot of time. Man, and they love going over there and getting to spend time with Grandma and Grandpa. Grandma's got a garden that's out back, and my oldest daughter, Hadley, loves going outside and working in the garden with Grandma and kind of like understanding, trying to learn about how all that works. KJ, my middle daughter, she's very mechanical, and so she loves to go out in the garage and kind of tinker with things that Grandpa's working on. And so they just love their time over there. And they have kind of like these traditions that they go to. And one time recently, a little earlier this summer, Hadley and KJ, our two oldest daughters, went over to Grandma and Grandpa's house while I went to work, and Abby, who's a high school teacher, off for the summer, was kind of in taking care of things around our house, and being with Berkeley, our youngest. She's about 4 months old. And so while they were spending time over at Grandma and Grandpa's house, they were having a blast. There's a tradition that they have. When KJ goes down for her nap, she'll go down around noon, give or take some time, and she'll go down for her nap, and during her nap, Grandpa and Hadley will make a trip to Dunkin' Donuts. When they go to Dunkin' Donuts, Grandpa goes and he gets his coffee, and the way Hadley tells the story is, "Daddy, Grandpa always surprises me with a donut." I don't know how you always surprise, but he always surprises her with a donut. And one of the things about KJ is KJ's one of those kids, like one of those one in a million kids where you really, you put her down for her nap and she'll just sleep. She'll just sleep. Sometimes she'll sleep almost, clear up until dinner. And so they put her down for a nap. Hadley and Grandpa went to Dunkin' Donuts to get their coffee and their always surprise donut. And while there, Hadley, who's a very cool, it's just cool to see her growing into this very compassionate, giving kid, asked Grandpa, "Hey, can we get a donut for KJ as well?" And Grandpa's like, "Absolutely." And when she gets from her nap, if it's not too close to dinner, she can eat the donut. So they get her donut, they come back home, but this day in particular, KJ sleeps until about 4:30, 4:45, almost until I'm about ready to come home from work, pick her up, and take them home. And so when she gets up, Grandpa says, "Hey, KJ, your sister, Hadley, got you a donut, but you have to wait until after dinner." And it's like, thanks, Grandpa, for reinforcing that one, but putting the temptation right out there in front of her, but thanks for saying, after dinner. And so she's, got a clear understanding. Okay, I've got a donut, but I've got to wait until after dinner in order for me to eat this donut. So I come home, I pick them up, I take them over to our house. Now, Hadley's been outside with Grandma in the garden, and she's just a mess. She's just covered in dirt from head to toe. And I realize I've got to hose her off before she can come in and sit down at the dinner table. And so I leave Hadley in the garage, and I take KJ inside. Now, when I come inside, what I've discovered or what I learned is Abby, my wife, has had a really difficult day with Berkeley, our youngest. We were going through our first round of teething, and if you've had kids, all bets are off on schedules and getting them to sleep and everything like that when they're teething. And when I went inside, she had finally gotten Berkeley for the first time in the day to eat really well and also to sleep. The problem was Berkeley was asleep in Abby's arms on the couch. And you can't move with her. She doesn't sleep very well, so it's you just got to keep her asleep. So Abby, you stay there. I've got to go out in the garage. KJ, don't make a mess, which telling an 18-month-old is, not really, going to work. This is where you hear parents talk about how sometimes they've got this, when you have more than two kids, you've got to switch from man-to-man to cover defense. Well, KJ was under she knew exactly what she was going to do. She's like, "Mom and Dad are in cover defense, and I'm the open man. So I know what's about to happen." So I was like, "Okay, I'm going to go outside, take care of Hadley. You keep Berkeley asleep. KJ, don't make a mess." So I go out into the garage, and the rest of the story is told to you through the eyes of my wife. As soon as the door shuts, KJ goes to work. She walks over, she gets a step stool. She pulls it around to the island where I sat her bagged donut. She pulls a step stool around. She gets up on the step stool. She grabs her bag donut, gets down off the step stool, walks over to the dining room table, pulls out her chair, sets the bag donut on her chair, crawls up into her chair, into her booster seat, sets the bag donut on the table, sits down in her booster seat, and buckles herself. She buckles herself into the seat. And all this time, Abby is coaching her the same exact way or parenting her the same exact way I would be parenting right now. Now, KJ, remember, no donut before dinner. KJ, don't you eat that donut. KJ, no donut before dinner. So KJ, at this point in time, she's there. She's got her bag donut. She begins to pull the donut out of the bag. And at this point in time, you begin like conceding things as a parent. So it's no longer, KJ, don't you eat that donut. It's all, okay, KJ, how about one bite? One bite of donut, KJ, that's it. Only one bite before dinner. Okay, and KJ's like going back and forth between mom and the donut, and so it's one bite. And so KJ goes, and you could tell by the look on her face that she loved that bite of donut. And instantly, Abby begins to kind of parent. Okay, KJ, you've had your one bite. No more bites before dinner, KJ. Wait till after dinner to eat this donut, KJ. You've had your one bite. No more bites. And KJ goes, and I quote, uh-oh, and takes another bite of donut. Abby says, okay, KJ, stop eating that donut. And KJ says, no. KJ, stop. No, just keeps eating. I finally come back inside from the garage from cleaning Hadley up, and I see this picture. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what's happened. My wife, Abby's still on the couch laughing so hard she can't say anything. She's like crying. I'm like, KJ, what happened? And she goes, uh-oh. I said, what did you do, KJ? She said, want some? No, KJ, I don't want to. So she had demolished the entire chocolate glazed donut. Now this sets us up so well for what we're talking about next in our God of Grace series. Last week we started a new series called God of Grace. And the word grace is probably got to be one of the most, if not the most important word for us to understand in our Bibles. But one of the difficult things about it is grace is probably also one of the most mysterious words in the Bible, one of the most difficult things, because our world doesn't work like grace. We live in an eye for eye world. You do to me what I'm going to do to you. That's the world but simply put, a good street definition for grace is an undeserved gift. Like the idea of even though you're supposed to pay, you don't have to. And they give you an undeserved gift. That's grace. The idea is we have sinned. We have separated ourselves from God. And even though we're supposed to pay for that, God says, man, I love you so much that I'm willing to send my son to pay that price. So that even though you're supposed to pay, you don't have to. And a guy named Paul wrote a letter to the church in Rome that we have in our Bibles. It's given the title Romans. And in it, there's a section of Romans 6, 7, and 8, the chapter 6, 7, and 8 in the book of Romans that Paul unpacks where he really tries to take a good hard look at what is grace and what does it mean for us and how do we live a life of grace. And last week, Dan, our lead minister, did a great job of unpacking Romans chapter 6. And I'd really encourage you, if you weren't here last week, to go home, get the podcast, download that, grab a CD in the lobby, and go home and listen to it, because we just don't have time to kind of unpack it all today, and we're going to pick up in Romans chapter 7. But the idea that he unpacks in Romans 6, or the idea that Paul writes about, is that grace frees us. It frees us from sin. And it doesn't free us to sin. It doesn't give us the freedom to kind of go and do whatever we want, but it frees us from sin. That we're not freed to sin, but we're freed from sin. And that idea of being free from sin, it resonates with us. Especially if you're a follower of Jesus and you've been a follower of Jesus for a while, because, so often sin feels like that. It feels like we're trapped in it. And we long to be free from it, free from addiction, pornography, substance, greed, hate, whatever you want to talk about. And we try not to. We try not to do these things, but just like a chocolate glazed donut, when mom and dad got their hands full, you just can't help it, and you take a bite, and you feel that guilt. And so Paul feels that. And that's what he begins to write about next in Romans chapter 7. He says this, starting in verse 14. This is what Paul says. He says, we know that the law is spiritual, but I'm unspiritual, sold as a slave to sin. What he talks about here, the law, he's talking about like what God tells us to do and what God tells us not to do. He says, we know that the law is spiritual. We know that the law is good. Like, I know those things he's asking me to do are good, but I'm not good. I'm not doing them. I know I shouldn't talk about him or her behind their back, but we take a bite of the donut. I know that I shouldn't look at, we take a bite of the donut. I know I really don't need this, and I know it's just going to get me deeper in debt, but I know I shouldn't cheat on, but I know what one drink usually leads to, but I'm here again. Like KJ, that donut looks just so good, and you've gotten too close to be willing to say no now. And you feel that guilt immediately, and then afterward you end up asking yourself, man, what am I doing? How did I end up here again? I think probably the best way for us to talk about what Paul writes here, that I know God's the law is good. I know that those are good, but I'm not good. I'm unspiritual. I think the best way for us to talk about it is like the wheels being knocked out of alignment on your car. The very first truck I had was a Mazda B3000, a little like Ford Ranger style truck. And I remember when my dad took me on the test drive, we were driving down this highway. It was Aviation Highway right by an airport in Maryland. And you get going, there's got a big, long section of it where it's straight. And when we got up to the speed limit, my dad took his hands off the wheel, and he listened really closely. And the truck stayed right in the lane. It stayed right there, and I asked that, because I wasn't sure what was going on. He said the wheels are in alignment, that it was really good that it stayed in the lane. You didn't hear any, like, rumbling or anything like that. Now, you fast forward a couple months, and many potholes and sudden stops and sharp turns later, and I remember going down that same highway, taking my hands off the wheel, and the truck beginning to veer out of the lane. It's because the wheels had been knocked out of alignment. You had to constantly correct in order to keep the vehicle within the lanes. And that's kind of what Paul's talking about here in verse 14. He says, I know God's commands are good. I know it's spiritual, but I'm not. My spiritual wheels have been knocked out of alignment. I keep drifting out of my lane. I know what God wants me to do, but because I've been selfish, because I want to do things my own way, I keep drifting out of my lane. And so then what he writes next is verse 15, chapter 7, verse 15. And it's a verse we talked about a couple months ago in our Pac-Man Fever series, but it's one of my favorite verses in the Bible because Paul says, I don't understand what I do. I don't get it. I don't understand what I do. For what I want to do, I do not do, but what I hate, I do. And we've been there. Where it's like, man, why do I keep doing this? Why do I keep giving into this temptation? And then ultimately that question, or those questions lead us to asking, man, how can I even be a Christian and still struggle like this? How can I be a Christian and keep doing this? And one of the things that I've seen come true for people, it came true in my own life, and I've seen it come true in others' lives, and or even like family members. Sometimes someone will respond to God's grace. Say, you know what? I want to follow Jesus. I want to place my trust in Jesus, and they'll come up, they'll get baptized, and then afterwards, they'll get frustrated with, man, not everything gets easy, about the fact that they're still struggling with sin, or we'll have a great church service on Sunday morning and walk out of here with the confidence to conquer the world, but then they find themselves still struggling on Monday morning with some sin. And what I'm afraid of is that sometimes we've begun to see that following God is we treat it like the superstar power in the Super Mario Brothers. By a round of applause, how many of you are fans of the original Super Mario Brothers? Yeah? All right, good. A lot of people. So if you're not familiar, I want to show you a quick video real quick that kind of shows you what the superstar power in Mario Brothers does. Check this out. It's good music. So what I'm afraid of sometimes is that we think, okay, well, you know what? I've tried doing it on my own. I'm going to place my faith. I'm going to place my trust in Jesus. And then life becomes a breeze after that. You know, like you don't have to worry about anything. You can just run through stuff and the rest of the level is going to be a breeze. And before you know it, you're hopping the blocks at the end, you're jumping, you're grabbing the flag, and boom, you're done. Man, wasn't that easy? But Paul writes about in chapter 7 is what he's pointing us to is it's not that way. Like you're still going to struggle. You're still going to face things that are tough. And what is so cool about chapter 7 specifically, and where Paul's unpacking next with grace, is Paul makes it clear. He takes us out of the past tense, and he brings us into present tense. In Romans 6, it was, I've died to sin, and I've now become a new person. But in Romans 7, Paul's not saying, man, this is how I used to be. Paul's talking about, man, I struggle right now. You know, and maybe you felt that. Curtis, maybe I should have died to sin, but sin feels very much alive within me right now. And that's what Paul's talking about here. And so he goes on in the next couple of verses, and he talks back and forth for a little bit, and he gives us some like tongue twister verses of the good I want to do, I don't do, and the things that I don't want to do, I go and do those things. And when I go and do those things and that I hate, man, I end up hating myself. Maybe sin is very much alive within me. Paul kind of comes to a point where he says, I'm a mess. And this is Paul. Like one of the foundations of our church, one of the many reasons, even if we don't know it, that many of us are sitting here this morning. And Paul says, I'm a mess. And it's not past tense, it's present tense. And we begin wondering, because we've been there as well, am I even a Christian? Am I even able to be considered a follower of Jesus still? Look how awful I can be. And so Paul begins to work towards his solution as he kind of gets to the end of chapter 7. He says this in verses 21 and 23. So Paul kind of comes to this conclusion as he's pointing us to his conclusion. He says, so I find this law at work. Although I want to do good, evil is right there with me. For in my inner being I delight in God's law, but I see another law at work in me, waging war against the law of my mind and making me a prisoner of the law of sin at work within me. Paul says, man, I feel this war. And I think this is where it gets key, is the waging war. Because we'll ask, man, can I even be considered a follower of Jesus? Look how I'm still struggling with this. I mean, it's been years, and I'm still struggling with this same sin. And I've been thinking a lot about this. Because I know this message is coming up, and grace is so mysterious, and we got to put some traction to this, understanding what Paul's talking about here. And I think the key question that we have to ask ourselves is when we're struggling with the same sin over and over and over again, I think the first question we need to ask is, do you feel like you are struggling? Do you feel like you're struggling? Do you feel like what Paul says here, that you're waging war against your sin? And if you do feel like you're waging war against your sin, then I think we're beginning the conversation in a good place. I think Paul would say, yeah, you're absolutely still a follower of Jesus. You're waging war against it. You're still actively struggling against your sin. But if you've surrendered to that sin, if you said, well, you know what? This is just the way it's going to be, and so I'm just going to kind of keep doing, I'm going to live it up, I'm just going to continue to do it, then I think the Bible and Paul would point us in a different direction, would say that the conversation needs to look a little different, that Paul would say, man, keep struggling against that sin. Keep fighting. Find someone else to fight alongside with you. Don't just give in. Don't just give in to that sin and become a slave to it again. Keep fighting. Keep waging war against that sin. One of the things that I thought was really cool was kind of in my own personal reading, separated from anything I'm studying for momentum. This verse popped up in Proverbs. Proverbs 14:9 says this. It says that fools make fun of guilt, but the godly acknowledge it and seek reconciliation. One of the things about struggling with this sin, one of the things that can really wear on us is the guilt that comes with it. But what I think is really cool about this is this proverb here tells us, man, guilt isn't a horrible thing. It doesn't have to be a horrible thing, because it says fools make fun of guilt. Fools laugh it off. Fools bury it. Fools ignore guilt. They try and hope that it'll just go away. But just burying the guilt, just trying to ignore it, hoping it'll go away and take care of itself, actually leads to fear. Fear of like, oh man, what if somebody saw that and I didn't know? Or when is this going to pop up again to bite me in the butt? It leads to fear, and ultimately you're still struggling with whatever that thing is. There's no freedom there. But the proverb goes on and says, but the godly acknowledge it. They acknowledge that guilt, and then they seek reconciliation. The godly, they own it. They try to make it right, and then they try not to repeat. They ask for help. And this is what leads to freedom. This is where you experience grace. The fool mocks guilt. The fool laughs it off, but the godly acknowledge it and seek reconciliation. So I think a really good action step for if you do feel like you are actively struggling against some sin, man, I think a great action step is to begin really actively praying against your struggle. To not wait till it just pops up, because Paul goes on to write later, like, I feel like I start to get a good handle on this thing, and then all of a sudden it jumps me out of nowhere, and I find myself in there again. And so I think, man, to begin actively praying against whatever that struggle is. God, help me to stand up against temptation. God, help me not to lie today. God, help me not to lust. God, help me not to speak evil. God, help me not to crave my addiction. God, help me to care for others instead of just caring for myself. And by actively praying against it, maybe you need to do that 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 times a day. God, help me not to give in to that temptation today. God, help me to stand up against a temptation. Instead of just waiting until it shows up and then reacting, you're proactively taking a stand against it. That might be one of the best action steps we could do for a sin that we continually struggle with. And then one of the things that's crazy about grace is even though once we experience grace, we could still fall into this temptation that we have to balance these scales, right? We have this idea that we're going, one of these days God's going to judge us, and He's going to weigh our good and our bad. And even once we experience God's grace, we think, okay, I need to start going to work at eliminating some sins from my life, and I need to do some good to outweigh the bad. But what happens when we do that is a byproduct of it is we'll begin to judge spiritual maturity by how pure we are. And by how much you do or do not sin. But ultimately what that leads to is you stopping showing grace to yourself and to others. And here's the thing. Proof of spiritual maturity, this is where I think Paul is kind of pointing to in Romans chapter 7, that proof of spiritual maturity is not how pure you are, but proof of spiritual maturity is your awareness of your own impurity. That's the proof of spiritual maturity. It's not how pure you are. It's not like the number of things you can eliminate, because here's the bottom line. We're all sinners. We're all impure. There are no perfect people allowed at Momentum, thank God. So proof of spiritual maturity is not how pure you are, not how much sin you've eliminated from your life, but proof of spiritual maturity is being aware of your own sin. And don't miss this, because this is what's going to allow you to begin to experience grace in your own life. This is what's going to allow you to show grace to others and lead a life that's full of grace and hope and joy and peace and patience. This is what's going to open up that door for you to experience that freedom that Paul talks about. In his book, What's So Amazing About Grace, author Philip Yancey, he writes that we kind of live with this idea that one of these days we're going to stand in front of God, and he's going to separate us into 2 groups. He's going to separate us into the guilty, and He's going to separate us into the not guilty. But Yancey says, and the Bible shows us this, that God's actually going to divide us into 2 groups of guilty people. Those who recognize it and those who don't. Those who recognize their guilt and those who don't. And so what's Paul's answer to guilt? Like where is he going with this? What's the answer to our struggle? And Paul writes this as he closes out Romans chapter 7 with verses 24. This is what Paul says. What a wretched man that I am. Oh, like, great, Paul, thanks. This is really heading in a good direction. What a wretched man I am. Who will rescue me from this body that is subject to death? Verse 25, thanks be to God. Thanks be to God who delivers me through Jesus Christ our Lord. Thanks be to God who gave us Jesus. Essentially, where Paul, with his own active struggles against sin, where Paul allows his struggling to drive him, is just to a deeper worship and understanding of God's love. Essentially, it ends in worship and thankfulness for how great God is, for God's gift of grace. Thank God for Jesus. He builds this huge, long, emotional passage where he goes back and forth of like, man, I really struggle with myself, and it's this giant exclamation point of thanks be to God who gave us Jesus. His answer is, man, it's grace. It's grace. I still struggle, and God still loves me. I still struggle, and God still loves me. Ultimately, what Paul is emphasizing in this passage is that your need for grace does not stop. Your need for grace never stops. That's what he's highlighting in chapter 7. And one of the coolest things about the way he ends it is he's saying God doesn't want to stop giving you grace. Grace means that there is nothing that you can do. There's nothing you can do to make God love you more. But there is also nothing you can do to make God love you any less. One of the themes that becomes a theme in Paul writes most of our New Testament, which is like the post-Jesus stuff in our Bibles. And he writes a ton of different letters to a bunch of different churches. And there's a theme. One of the themes that begins to pop up in several of his letters is a verse that he wrote in Timothy. He wrote a letter to a mentor of his, or a mentee of his, somebody he was mentoring, a guy named Timothy. And Paul writes this in 1 Timothy 1, verse 15. He says, here's a trustworthy saying that deserves full acceptance. Here's something that everybody should agree with without any regard. Christ Jesus came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am the worst. And this has become kind of a popular verse in church circles, where some translations will say, where Paul says, I am the chief of sinners. But essentially, what Paul's saying here in this verse is like, hey, here's the deal. Jesus came to save sinners, and if we started stacking up your sins versus my sins, I've got to take first chair. If we start stacking up sins, I am the worst. I am the chief. I am the number one sinner. And here's what I think is really cool with Paul. With Paul, again, this is something I noticed recently. It's still present tense. Paul is years at this point in time when he writes this letter. He's towards the end of his life. Paul is years into following Jesus. And he still says, I am the worst sinner in the room. I am the worst. Man, thanks be to God for his grace. And what's so cool about this is verse 15. Once again, verses 16 and 17. It ends in him worshiping God. Man, I am the worst sinner in the room. Thanks be to God for how much he loves me. And that becomes a theme. And every single time where Paul points out, man, I am the worst sinner, it ends with him worshiping God. I think this is a good place for us to end up as well with this. To come to the place where we're willing to say, you know what? Man, I am the worst sinner in the room. Not I was the worst sinner, but like Paul, active. I am the worst sinner in the room. Because not only does that drive us to depend on God and love God more fully because of how much and how great he is, but think about this. Think about how our conversations with each other begin to change when we approach it from the standpoint of, I am the worst sinner in the room. Think about how that changes the conversations that you have with family members or friends on forgiveness. If you approach it of, man, I'm the one that needs to be forgiven the most. I've needed to be forgiven the most as well. Think about how that changes the conversation we're having on racism right now when we approach it from, I need the most grace. Think about how it changes the conversation that you have with your kids, parents, students. Think about how that changes conversations as you approach your parents. If you approach it from, I am the worst sinner in the room. I think a bottom line of this, a realization that we can come to, is that our messed upness challenges us to give grace to those who mess up against us. Our messed upness challenges us to give grace to those who mess up against us. Now, I think probably the coolest thing about this is Paul's identity doesn't stop at being the worst sinner in the room. There's a realization that happens there. Maybe it begins there. But for Paul, his identity always ends in God's love and in worshiping God and being thankful for what God did for him. With Paul, it starts with being aware of his sin, and it ends with thanking God for loving him. And you see that with the way he ends even Romans chapter 7 there, with thanks be to God for Jesus Christ. So what do? Here's our hope. I think a really cool story that I discovered recently is studying a bunch of different things, looking into grace, and the story about how Alcoholics Anonymous got founded. One of the very beginning stories that they had is one of the most fascinating to me, and I think demonstrates kind of sometimes what we struggle with God here. So Alcoholics Anonymous was started kind of originally by a guy that goes by the name of Bill W. And he tells the beginning of Alcoholics Anonymous in the second edition of the big book. And in this story, he tells Bill W. was a struggling alcoholic. And he began to find sobriety, but once he would find sobriety, he would find himself kind of falling back into alcoholism. And he realized he needed to help others find sobriety as well. And so you know what he did? He picked up the phone and he started cold calling people that he thought might be alcoholics, which just doesn't seem like a good route to go, you know? But he starts cold calling people that he's getting tips from other people. And then finally, he ends up connected to the wife of a guy named Dr. Bob. And Dr. Bob was a practicing surgeon who was also an alcoholic. And Bill W. and Dr. Bob, they started working together. And together, Dr. Bob found sobriety as well. And they had a kind of like a way that they would go through this, kind of like a method where they talk about the medical things that would happen, and that ultimately led to a need in a higher power. And for them, it was God. And they talked about how good, God was and their need for that grace and the mercy and the forgiveness. And so together, Bill W. and Dr. Bob, like, man, we got to help other people find this as well. Like, this is amazing. So what do? And they were like, well, we probably should stop cold calling people and asking if they're alcoholics. And like, yeah, that's a good idea. So what do? Well, Dr. Bob says, man, there are people all the time showing up in a hospital to sober up. Let's just go down there and see if we can talk to some of them. And so they go down to the hospital in Akron, Ohio. Pretty cool. There's Akron. And they show up and they get connected to a guy named Bill D., who ends up becoming the third and founding member of Alcoholics Anonymous. Bill D. had been checked into the hospital in order to sober up. And so they began talking to Bill D. and kind of going through their method, talking about the medical things that happen, and they moved into like the spiritual realm, the need for God, essentially. And at this point in time, he cuts off the conversation with this quote. This is what he says when he cuts them off. He says, "No," he says, "gentlemen, I hear what you're saying, but I'm too far gone for that. I've always believed in God. I used to be a deacon in the church. But boys, I've been in and out of this place 6 times in the past 4 months. This time in detoxes, I badly beat up one of the nurses. No, I know that I can't even get home from here sober. Gentlemen, I'm afraid to go out. No, it's too late for me. I still believe in God all right, but I know mighty well that He doesn't believe in me anymore." It may not be alcohol, but I'm sure there are probably several of us in the room that could express something very similar about another sin. Those 2 men, they came back the very next day, and overnight, Bill D. thought about their story, and he saw hope. And he thought, man, if they've been able to do it, maybe I can do with them what I've been unable to do on my own. And becomes the third founding member and finds sobriety as well. And many of us, I'm sure, have wondered, has God given up on me? Like, I believe in God all right, but I know that God, He's given up on me. God's grace is great and all, but I can't get a handle on this. And surely, if I've worn out grace with myself, I've worn out grace with Him. One of the coolest things, and this is why we can't stop with just today, is in the very next chapter, it says that there is nothing that can separate us from the love of Christ. I'm really excited to look about that chapter next week. But maybe even one of the simplest things we can start doing is John 3:16 says that God so loved the world that He gave His one and only Son, so that if you believe in Him, you might not perish but have everlasting life. Sometimes what we need to do is we need to replace the world. You know who's included in that? You are. And so maybe sometimes we need to start reading things as, for God so loved Curtis. And what if you began seeing yourself as the one Jesus loved? Not as a screw-up, not as a sinner, not as perfect, not as a struggler. But what if you began having your identity as the one that Jesus loves? So if you're still struggling with sin, man, get in line. We all are. There's no perfect people allowed. We still struggle, but thanks be to God for his grace. And so what's going to happen is I want you to stand right now. I want you to stand where you're at. And I'm hoping we could end today kind of the same way Paul ends chapter 7, where he ends in worshiping God, thanking God for his grace, because grace wins. We're going to sing a new song. It's called a song, More Than Conquerors. And I love the lyrics of the song because it's kind of like, I mean, the way I see it, and I don't know if this is okay. I didn't ask if this is, but it's kind of like a bar fight song. Because it says there's no surrender, there's no retreat. I ain't giving into this sin. We are free and we're redeemed. We declare over despair, God, you are the hope. Every chain is breakable. With you, God, we are victorious. So let's end today in the same way Paul ends chapter 7, with a great big exclamation point. You know what? I do still struggle, but thanks be to God that he still loves me. Let's sing.